Ice storm trapped alien girls for days. This human's choice saved two worlds. The roar of the cryostorm on Xylos was a physical thing, a constant pressure of sub-zero wind that made the reinforced walls of Jake Reyes's isolated weather station groan in protest. Outside, the world had vanished, replaced by a screaming vortex of white as ice crystals the size of shrapnel, scoured the frozen landscape under a perpetually twilight sky. It was the kind of storm that erased things from existence, and Jake's long-range scanner had just confirmed the impossible. Something had been erased right out of the sky. He moved through the sterile confines of the station with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and profound boredom. A flick of his wrist calibrated an atmospheric sensor array he knew was being sandblasted into uselessness. A few keystrokes logged barometric pressure data that was less a measurement and more a scream. Each task was a familiar ghost, a small act of penance in this cold, empty purgatory he'd chosen for himself. This was his exile, a quiet life of paying for a loud failure. Then a piercing shriek sliced through the storm's deep drone. A red alert klaxon, a sound he hadn't heard in 3 years, pulsed from the long-range scanner console. Jake's first reaction was a flare of irritation. A glitch. Another piece of over-engineered Alliance tech succumbing to the cold. He stalked over to the console, ready to silence it, but his hand froze above the panel. The signal was clean. Non-Alliance, high-energy signature, and it was falling. Fast. No ship, Alliance or otherwise, should be able to navigate a Class 9 cryostorm. It wasn't just improbable, it was suicide. His fingers flew across the console, the old instincts kicking in. He isolated the signature, running a diagnostic. Bioorganic power core. Small, a shuttle or a scout ship at best. Fragile technology, notoriously susceptible to catastrophic energy failure in extreme cold. He mapped the trajectory, a desperate, uncontrolled plummet that ended less than 2 clicks from his station. The ship's energy signature was already guttering like a dying candle. Jake stared at the screen, his lips pursed. Without a stable power source for heat, in this storm, any survivors would be flash frozen solid in less than an hour. To do nothing was the smart choice, the safe choice. No one would ever know. He could just let the storm finish its work. The thought was a cold comfort, but it was soured by a memory that surfaced unbidden. A different screen, years ago, showing cascading ecological collapse. His project, his failure. He had watched the data then, frozen by indecision, by pride, until it was too late. He wouldn't do that again. He couldn't. A grim commitment settled over him, displacing the comfortable shroud of cynicism. He wasn't the brilliant xenobotanist who had tried to reshape worlds anymore, but he was still a man. And out there, in the screaming maw of the storm, someone was dying. That was enough. Jake moved with a sudden, sharp purpose. He bypassed his main storage locker, heading for the emergency cache. He unstrapped the powered thermal sledge from its mooring, its battery pack glowing a healthy green. He stuffed a canvas bag with chemical heat packs, high-density protein bars, and a spool of insulated cabling. From a locked case, he pulled a small, illegal device, a distress beacon jammer. The Alliance didn't need to know about this. Not yet. This was his responsibility. Stepping into the airlock felt like stepping into a tomb. The inner door hissed shut, and for a moment, there was only the sound of his own breathing. Then he hit the cycle command. The outer door groaned open, and the world dissolved into a physical assault of wind and ice. The storm tore at him, a solid wall of force that tried to drive him back. He leaned into it, his magnetic boots clamping to the exterior walkway as he wrestled the sledge onto the ice. He pulled his thermal hood tight, the world reduced to the green-tinged tactical display of his visor. The crash site was a single waypoint in a universe of roaring white. The journey was a brutal, grinding battle. His visor's display flickered, useless against the static charge of the ice-saturated air. The sledge's navigation system failed within 100 meters. He was blind, navigating by instinct, by the faint slope of the terrain he knew by heart, and by sheer, stubborn endurance. Ice shards hammered against his suit, each impact a dull thud that vibrated through his bones. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the suit's seals, leeching warmth with a relentless hunger. This was what the universe was really like beyond the climate-controlled hulls of starships, raw, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent. He found the ship by nearly walking into it. A dark, elegant curve of something that didn't belong, half swallowed by a massive snowdrift. It was a vessel made of sweeping organic lines, more grown than built, its hull shimmering with a pearlescent sheen even under the storm's dim light. But it was a dead thing. A long, jagged crack ran down its flank, and the graceful fins that were probably sensor arrays were snapped and frozen solid. The pinnacle of some alien race's technology, shattered by simple cold. The main hatch was frozen shut. Jake wasted no time with finesse. He used a plasma cutter from the sledge's emergency kit, slicing through the delicate alien alloy with a shower of angry sparks. The metal screamed in protest before he could pry a section open and force his way inside. The interior was even colder than the storm, the air perfectly still and frigid. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across walls that seemed to be made of woven, hardened fiber. And there, huddled against a silent console, were the survivors. Two of them. They were humanoid, but impossibly slender and delicate, with skin the color of pale lilac. The older one was curled around the smaller, a protective gesture even in unconsciousness. Strange, faintly glowing sacs, like captured starlight in translucent membranes, were clustered on their shoulders and arms. The light within them was pulsing, a slow, weak rhythm that was terrifyingly out of sync. Jake knelt, his gauntlet brushing the snow from the older one's cheek. His suit's bioscanner registered two life signs, both critical, both fading fast. He attached a medical sensor to her thin wrist. Core temperature dangerously low, but it was the other readings that made his blood run cold. Cellular decay, systemic metabolic failure. He glanced at the glowing sacs on her body. As her life signs dipped on his monitor, the light in the sacs dimmed in unison. It wasn't just the cold killing them. It was something else, something deeper, something biological. There was no time to figure it out here. He couldn't revive the ship. Its organic heart was frozen solid. He worked quickly, wrapping them in the self-heating thermal blankets from his kit. They were lighter than he expected, almost bird-like. He secured them carefully to the sledge. The older sister, Estelle, and the younger one, Lyra, side by side. The journey back was a desperate, muscle-burning ordeal, a slow-motion race against a clock he couldn't see. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was dragging two lives back from the edge of oblivion. He stumbled back through the airlock, the station's warmth and light a shocking relief. He guided the sledge directly to his small medbay, a room that had seen nothing more serious than a sprained wrist. He transferred the two aliens to the diagnostic beds, connecting them to the station's medical systems. The machines whirred to life, flooding their frail bodies with warmth and stabilizing fluids. Their core temperatures began to rise, inch by painful inch, from lethal to merely critical. But as he watched the monitors, a knot of dread tightened in his gut. Their vital signs, though stable, refused to improve. They continued their slow, steady decline. And on their shoulders, the beautiful, starlit sacs were now barely glowing at all. Their light faded to the faintest of embers. He had saved them from the storm, only to deliver them to a new silent crisis. The cold was no longer the threat, but they were still dying, and he had absolutely no idea why. The bioluminescent sacs on Estelle's and Lyra's bodies, which had pulsed with a faint, urgent light when Jake first found them, now barely glimmered, a dying ember against their pale skin. Jake's portable med scanner chirped a low, mournful tone, displaying rapidly deteriorating vital signs. It wasn't just the cold, not anymore. He'd wrapped them in thermal blankets, cranked the station's meager heaters, but the decline was relentless, a biological clock ticking down with chilling precision. This was something deeper, something unique to their delicate, alien physiology. He worked with frantic desperation, his breath fogging in the cool air of the station's main bay. His limited Alliance-issue medical kit, usually reserved for frostbite or minor lacerations, felt woefully inadequate. He ran cellular analyses, cross-referenced what little xenobotanical data he'd bothered to keep from his old life. But the Iridian biology was a closed book without their ship's specialized organic systems. Cellular degradation was accelerating, a cascade failure he couldn't halt, couldn't even fully understand. He was guessing, flailing in the dark, and they were dying. A soft, reedy sound pulled him from the grim readings. Lyra, the younger Iridian, stirred. Her large, dark eyes, like pools of liquid obsidian, blinked open, focusing on the blinking lights of Jake's scanner. She lifted a small, delicate hand, tracing a pattern in the air, a silent question. Then with a soft hum, she pointed to one of the dimming sacs on her stomach. Curiosity, pure and unburdened by fear, flickered in her gaze. Estelle, her sister, stirred too, a soft groan escaping her lips. Her eyes, sharper, more wary, found Lyra, then Jake. She saw Lyra's gesture, saw Jake's baffled expression, and a flicker of desperate willpower hardened her weak features. With immense effort, she lifted her own hand, touching the fading sac on her abdomen. Then slowly, deliberately, she mimed pressing something into the ground, her fingers wiggling as if roots were spreading, then reaching upwards, forming a soaring, invisible canopy. A tree, a forest, a world. It wasn't just them, it was everything. The realization hit Jake with the force of a physical blow, a forgotten piece of his past slamming into the present. The sacs weren't medical devices. They were seed pods, dormant, dying. The Iridians weren't just carrying their biology, they were carrying their ecosystem. His xenobotany training, buried under years of self-imposed exile, screamed to life. The extreme cold wasn't just a threat, it was actively killing the seeds, extracting the life from the seed bearers themselves. They were not merely patients, they were living vessels for a dying world. Seeds, he whispered, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. He spun, his mind racing, scanning the storage bay he'd intended to use for long-term supply caches. It was cold, sterile, but it was a space. He started moving, a man possessed, a furious energy driving his hands. Salvaged thermal piping from an old hydroponics unit was ripped from the wall. Repurposed UV lamps, once illuminating his failed research, were pulled from dusty crates. Geothermal heat taps, meant for emergency power, were rerouted, their raw warmth directed into the designated area. He would make a greenhouse, a makeshift arboretum carved from ice in desperation. He improvised nutrient solutions in old coffee mugs, mixing his emergency protein paste with purified meltwater and salvaged mineral supplements from his xenobotanical samples. He spliced fragile wiring with clumsy gloved fingers, ignoring the chill that seeped into his bones. Every action was a desperate plea against the encroaching silence, a testament to human ingenuity, twisting disparate low-tech components into a complex biological support system. The air filled with the metallic tang of heated elements and the faint earthy scent of ancient soil, a ghost of his past. Estelle watched from her makeshift cot, her body still weak, but her eyes, those deep, luminous pools, fixed on Jake's frantic efforts. The initial mistrust she'd worn like a cloak when he found them slowly frayed, replaced by a dawning, fragile hope. When the first crude enclosure hummed to life, radiating a gentle warmth, she pushed herself up. Her delicate fingers, tipped with soft, pale pads, reached out, pressing against the warm glass of the newly formed greenhouse, a silent acknowledgement of his desperate, selfless dedication. As the initial seeds, carefully extracted from the dimming sacs, began to pulse with a faint, returning glow within the crude greenhouse, Estelle communicated again, this time with a profound sorrow that seeped into Jake's very bones. Through simple gestures, fragmented sounds, and images that coalesced in his mind with unsettling clarity, she spoke of Iridia, her homeworld. A verdant paradise now consumed by a synthetic plague, a gray blight that withered all plant life, leaving only sterile dust. She conveyed their mission, their desperate flight. They were not explorers. They were refugees. Seed bearers, carrying the last genetic remnants of Iridia, the final hope for their dying world. They had fled just before Iridia's final collapse, a desperate, final gamble against oblivion. Jake, still reeling from the weight of her revelation, dove into her ship's salvage logs, seeking any data that might help. And then he found it, a residual biosignature, faint but unmistakable, within the blight's genetic markers. His blood ran cold, the gray blight, mutated, corrupted. It wasn't alien. It was his, a twisted progeny of his own failed terraforming nanite project, the one the Alliance had declared neutralized and harmlessly disposed of decades ago. The ecological setback he'd caused, humanity's unwitting guilt, the burden of that discovery crushed him. His past failure, a personal demon he thought he'd outrun, had metastasized into a galactic catastrophe. He had played a part, however small and unintentional, in the apocalypse of an entire world. The Iridian's survival was no longer just about compassion, it was a desperate, agonizing chance at redemption. Amidst his internal turmoil, a jarring static crackled through his comm unit, overriding the storm's roar. A looping, scrambled broadcast, its signal strength steadily increasing. Cathar Syndicate. Jake recognized the predatory cadence, the distinctive energy signature of their scavenger ships. They had detected the Iridian crash. Exotic biologicals. A synthesized voice purred through the static. Unique energy signature, a rare find. They were coming, the message clarified. They knew what the Iridians were, or at least their value. An astronomical sum of credits was offered. Enough to buy a small moon, enough to escape Xylos, enough to bury his past failures under a mountain of wealth. An easy way out, a life of comfort. Jake's gaze drifted from the blinking numbers on his comm display to Lyra, sleeping peacefully on her cot, her delicate hand resting near the small, glowing enclosure. Then his eyes met Estelle's. She was watching him, her face a mask of exhaustion, but her luminous eyes held a profound, ancient fear, sensing the profound internal conflict tearing him apart. He thought of the wealth, the escape. He thought of Iridia, a dying world, and his own culpability. He thought of the two fragile lives trusting him. His past failures had brought him here, to this desolate rock. But this time, he wouldn't run. He wouldn't fail them. With a primal roar that tore from his throat, Jake's fist slammed down. The comm unit exploded in a shower of sparks and fractured plastic, severing the connection. The offer, the temptation, gone. The choice was made. He would protect them. He would fight. The storm still raged outside, a howling vortex of ice and fury. But Jake knew a far more dangerous storm was brewing, one that would break upon his station with the clearing skies. Jake moved through the station like a ghost, every sense hyper-alert, assessing. The structural integrity of the main habitation module was solid, built to withstand Xylos' worst, but the attached storage bay, now the greenhouse, was a weaker point. His eyes scanned the comm station. The smashed unit a stark reminder of his choice. He ran a hand over the rough console, then flicked open a schematic of the station's layout. Weak points glowed red. The main airlock, the cargo bay door, the external power conduits. He mentally overlaid the station with a tactical grid, picturing a Cathar assault. They'd come fast, brutal, and utterly without mercy. His equipment was laughably sparse. A plasma cutter, a few antique pulse rifles from a derelict survey vessel, and a handful of charges meant for mining. It was nothing against a syndicate landing craft, but he had the station, and he had the storm. A plan, desperate and crude, began to form in his mind. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a survivor. He'd built, maintained, and scavenged on a dozen frontier worlds. His knowledge of this rock was absolute. The storm itself was a weapon if he could just learn to wield it. Estelle watched him from the greenhouse, her slender form a silent sentinel beside Lyra's slumbering cot. Her initial apprehension at his violent destruction of the comm unit had morphed into a watchful intensity. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the grim set of his jaw, the frantic energy in his movements. Her gaze flicked from his face to the broken comm, then to the swirling white outside, and a dawning, terrible comprehension filled her large, dark eyes. Jake caught her gaze, a sharp, quick gesture to the shattered comm panel. "Bad," he mouthed, then made a chopping motion with his hand. "Come." He pointed outside, then formed a crude, predatory shape with his hands, mimicking a ship descending. They come. Hurt. He pointed to Lyra, then to the seeds, then held a hand up as if to shield them. No. Estelle's delicate features hardened, a fierce, protective persistence blooming in her expression. She reached out, her hand settling on Lyra's small shoulder, then sweeping to cover the glowing seed sacs on her own body. Her eyes met Jake's, unwavering, radiating an absolute persistence that transcended language. She would defend them. Jake nodded, a silent pact forged in the hum of the station in the roar of the storm. He pulled on his insulated suit, the thick material, stiff and cumbersome, and headed for the exterior access. The wind shrieked a deafening welcome as he cycled through the airlock, ice crystals immediately clinging to his visor. He dragged salvaged solar panel arrays, their reflective surfaces now repurposed to key positions. He angled them to concentrate the faint geothermal warmth rising from deep fissures in the planet's crust, focusing the heat onto specific sections of the ice-scoured ground. The ice hissed, steaming, melting into deep, unseen channels. Then he'd cut the power, letting the sub-zero air slam back in, rapidly refreezing the water, creating treacherous hidden pitfalls beneath a thin, deceptive crust of snow. Hours blurred into a grueling cycle of freezing labor. Inside, Lyra, now more alert, followed his movements with wide-eyed curiosity. Her gaze lingered on his plasma cutter, its blue-white flame momentarily softening the grim lines around Jake's mouth. He found himself pausing, holding up a wrench, demonstrating its weight, a brief silent connection with the innocent he was fighting to protect. Later, crawling through narrow utility tunnels beneath the station, Jake rerouted geothermal waste heat vents. He'd install pressure plates, linking them to a surge valve. Any heavy impact near a potential entry point would trigger a sudden, scalding burst of steam, blinding and disorienting. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of heated pipes, the hiss of building pressure. He returned to the main habitat, hands numb, muscles screaming. Estelle stood by the wall, her slender fingers splayed against the cold metal. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to a distant, inaudible whisper. She turned as he entered, her eyes locking onto his. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed her hand against the floor plate, then traced a complex pattern in the air, pointing outwards, then back to herself. Her meaning was clear. She could feel something, seismic vibrations, distant movement. Jake's mind, weary but still sharp, instantly grasped the implication. "Warning system," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the cold. He pointed to her, then to a map of the surrounding terrain. "You track! Where they come from?" He gestured. Estelle nodded, a flicker of pride in her gaze. She placed her hand back on the floor, focusing, her body a delicate antenna attuned to the frozen ground. Their collaborative efforts deepened their bond with every passing hour. The station transformed from Jake's solitary outpost into their shared fortress, a testament to a growing, symbiotic reliance on each other's unique strengths. He built the traps. She would tell him where to spring them. He pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion, the physical toll of constant, freezing labor compounded by the mental strain of strategizing against a superior, unknown enemy. His limbs ached, his eyes burned, but the thought of Lyra's wide-eyed gaze, of Estelle's fierce drive, drove him on. During a brief lull, as Jake sat slumped against a workbench, trying to force lukewarm water past his dry throat, Estelle approached. She held out a small foil-wrapped tube, some form of nutrient paste, likely from her ship's emergency rations. Its scent was subtly floral, alien. He hesitated, then accepted the offering. The shared vulnerability, the simple gesture of care, transcended the chasm of species differences. The cryostorm, after days of unremitting fury, began to show definitive signs of breaking. The wind, which had screamed like a banshee, now merely whined, a receding lament. The perpetual twilight of Xylos, a uniform, blinding white for what felt like an eternity, slowly began to give way to a faint, ominous glow on the horizon. The atmospheric haze thinned, revealing bruised purple-gray streaks where the sky should have been. Jake and Estelle conducted a final, tense inspection of their prepared defenses. He checked the pressure plates, the solar array placements, the rerouted steam vents. She placed her hand on the cold floor, her head cocked, listening to the ground. Their eyes met, a shared moment of dogged persistence, of unspoken willpower. There was no going back. Then against the clearing sky, a distant dark silhouette appeared. It was small at first, a smudge on the horizon, but it grew rapidly. Landing lights piercing the lingering atmospheric haze flared to life. The Cathar Syndicate ship. Estelle's body tensed, a sudden sharp intake of breath. Her hand pressed harder against the floor, her gaze fixed on a specific point in the distant landscape. She pointed, a clear, definitive gesture. Their landing trajectory, their primary assault vector. The distant heavy thud of the Cathar landing craft reverberated through the station's structure. A deep, resonant boom that shook the very foundations. It signaled the immediate, violent commencement of the siege. The Cathar Syndicate's landing craft, a black wedge against the bruised sky, dropped its ramp with a pneumatic hiss. Harsh, white-blue spotlights speared the churning snow. Figures, bulky and armored environmental suits, began to disembark, fanning out with practiced precision. 4 distinct assault vectors, Jake noted grimly, each armed with heavy energy rifles, began their slow, deliberate approach toward the station. The crunch of their boots on the packed ice was a low guttural thrum that vibrated through the reinforced floor. Estelle's hand, cool and light, settled on his arm. Her amber eyes, usually wide with curiosity, were now narrowed, focused inward. 3 heavy, she whispered, the Iridian cadence low and urgent. Flanking left, 2 light, direct. Another pair sweeping wide to the right. Heavy armor on the lead elements. She didn't need a scanner. The ground beneath her feet was a symphony of vibrations. All right, Jake muttered, his fingers flying over the console. His breath plumed white in the rapidly cooling command center. Let's give them a welcome. He smacked his head down on a large red button. A series of deep groans echoed from outside, followed by splintering ice. Sharp, startled cries pierced the howling wind as the ground beneath the lead Cathar forces dissolved into hidden pits. The first wave vanished, as swallowed by the treacherous ice, their screams cut short by the crushing depths. Disarray rippled through the syndicate lines. The remaining Cathar were quick to adapt. Their energy weapons flared, crimson beams lancing out to melt the ice, carving unstable, steaming pathways around the new hazards. The hiss of superheated water meeting frozen ground was deafening, the air filling with an acrid ozone tang. They were good, Jake conceded, but not good enough. He hit another sequence, overriding the station's geothermal regulators. With a thunderous roar, scalding steam vents erupted from the ground. Geysers of blinding vapor shooting skyward, directly into the Cathar's advancing pass. The thick white clouds billowed, disorienting them, forcing them to halt, shields flaring uselessly against the pervasive heat and lack of visibility. Shouts of frustration, guttural and sharp, rippled through their ranks. But even as the main force regrouped, Jake heard a harsh scrape grind against the outer hull, a sound that grated on his teeth. "Breach!" Estelle cried, pointing towards a section of the outer laboratory. A smaller Cathar unit, utilizing specialized climbing gear, had scaled the sheer ice wall beneath the steam and was cutting a hole through the reinforced plating. Metal shrieked as plasma ate through the alloy. Jake didn't hesitate. "Stay here with Lyra," he ordered, grabbing a repurposed plasma cutter from a nearby workbench. Its energy cell whined to life, casting a blue glow on his grim face. He burst through the inner door, sprinting down the narrow utilitarian corridor. The air grew colder, the wind's shriek more immediate. He reached the lab just as a Cathar commando, their helmet's visor glowing red, pulled themselves through the jagged opening. The air filled with the crackle of the plasma cutter. Jake moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who knew every twist and turn of his own ship. The tight corridors were his ally. He parried a rifle butt, the plasma cutter spitting an arc of superheated gas, severing the Cathar's weapon arm. The alien shrieked, falling back, black blood sizzling on the freezing floor. Another, just behind him, lunged. Suddenly, a small, frightened whimper echoed down the corridor from the command center. "Lyra!" The sound was a jolt, a physical punch to Jake's gut, and for a split second his focus fractured. His protective instincts flared, pulling his attention away from the immediate threat. That momentary lapse nearly cost him everything. A dark form separated from the shadows of the breached wall. A Cathar operative, hidden, silent, lunged. Jake felt a sudden, forceful shove, Estelle's slender form slamming into him, pushing him violently out of the path of a vibro knife that would have found his neck. The blade scraped against the reinforced wall where he'd been standing, a metallic shriek that vibrated through his bones. Outside, the Cathar leadership, their voices cold and precise over the comms, had seen enough. "Cease ground advance," a voice barked, amplified and distorted. "Concentrated bombardment. Target structural supports. Collapse the facility." The station groaned, a deeper, more agonizing sound this time. Explosions ripped through the outer shell, seismic tremors shaking the very foundations. A section of the outer laboratory wall shuddered, then peeled away with a deafening roar of tearing metal and shattering ice. The exposed section of the lab, including the nascent arboretum, imploded, sucked out into the cryostorm. A direct, unstable breach yawned, a gaping wound in the station's side, letting the full, murderous fury of Xylos pour in. The temperature plummeted. "We can't hold," Jake yelled over the cacophony, pulling Estelle and a trembling Lyra tighter to him. "Move! Deeper inside!" He guided them through collapsing sections, ducking under falling debris, their path illuminated by the emergency lights flickering erratically. Dust and ice particles filled the air, stinging their eyes. The Cathar, now unhindered by the storm's fury and emboldened by the station's collapse, pursued them through the damaged interior. Their heavy boots thudded closer, their comm chatter closing in. They adapted, spreading out, using the chaotic layout to their advantage, hunting them like prey. Jake spotted at a junction where a collapsed support beam had created a narrow bottleneck. "Here!" he grunted, shoving Lyra behind a reinforced console. He began kicking loose sections of plating, twisting conduits, and using his plasma cutter to melt an already fractured pipe, sending a torrent of super-chilled coolant gushing onto the floor. It froze almost instantly, creating a rapidly expanding, knee-deep slush pool. He piled heavy debris, twisting metal and shattered monitors, creating a makeshift barricade. Just as the first Cathar rounded the corner, their targeting lasers locking onto Jake, Estelle let out a soft, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't a sound Jake heard with his ears, but felt in his bones, a subtle vibration that permeated the air. The Cathar soldiers stumbled, their weapons wavering, targeting reticles flickering wildly. A low, confused grumble rippled through their ranks as their comms hissed with static, their heads tilted, as if trying to clear a sudden, disorienting pressure in their minds. "Now!" Estelle gasped, a bead of sweat tracing a path down her silver hair. The psionic field, subtle and localized, was clearly a strain. Jake didn't need a second invitation. He launched his desperate counterattack, using the Cathar's momentary sensory dissonance. He was a whirlwind of motion, the plasma cutter carving through the air, forcing them back from their immediate position of entry, buying precious seconds. The reprieve was temporary, Jake knew it. The station was a tomb, crumbling around them. He glanced at Estelle, her face strained but resolute. "The ship," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Our only chance is to disable their transport. We have to go outside, into the canyons." The words tasted like ash. It was a suicidal gamble, but the station offered no other path. Estelle's eyes met his, wide and understanding, a flicker of fear quickly replaced by fierce grit. Outside, the Cathar forces, having regrouped and shaken off Estelle's disorienting field, renewed their assault with increased ferocity. Explosions rattled the remaining sections of the station, the air thick with the smell of ozone and melting ice. They were pushing relentlessly. Jake took Lyra, bundling her securely in his arms, wrapping her in his thickest thermal blanket. Estelle nodded, her hand finding his. Their eyes locked, a silent promise. They were a family now, bound by blood, by choice, by shared peril. There was no going back. With a final desperate breath, Jake kicked open a maintenance hatch leading directly into the roaring cryo canyons. They were making their final, desperate break from the collapsing station, directly into the perilous, storm-ravaged unknown. Jake, Estelle, and Lyra scrambled through the treacherous ice canyons, the wind a relentless sculptor of their fragile passage. Jagged spires of frozen water loomed, then vanished in the swirling remnants of the storm. Behind them, the Cathar ground forces, though thinned, were still a snarling threat, their heavy boots crunching on the packed snow, their energy weapons spitting scarlet arcs that vaporized ice in sizzling explosions. Jake pushed Lyra ahead, Estelle covering their flank, her quick glancing movements betraying a newfound agility in this brutal landscape. They ducked behind a crystalline ridge, the frigid air burning in Jake's lungs. From their temporary vantage, he scanned the canyon floor. Below, the Cathar landing craft sat, a hulking armored beetle, now fully exposed as the last of the blizzard faded into a dull gray twilight. Its engines pulsed faintly, a low thrum that promised imminent escape. Not on his watch. His eyes narrowed, picking out the seams and fractures in the sheer ice walls around them. He knew Xylos's geology, had studied its glacial movements, its tectonic stresses, the way ice clung precariously to ancient rock. He hefted the salvaged thermal lance, its power cell glowing a dull orange. Aiming for a massive ice overhang, a colossal frozen wave suspended hundreds of meters above the landing craft, he activated the lance. A focused beam of incandescent heat licked out. A whisper against the canyon's roar, carving a precise, invisible line into the ancient ice. A tremor ran through the ground, then another. A low groan, like the planet itself sighing, rumbled through the air. Jake grabbed Estelle and Lyra, pulling them back just as the overhang groaned again. Louder, deeper. Then with an ear-splitting crack that echoed for miles, the world above them fractured. A controlled avalanche, a thunderous cascade of ice and rock, roared down the canyon walls. It swallowed the Cathar landing craft whole, a tidal wave of frozen destruction that silenced the enemy threat with brutal finality, sealing their escape route under tons of Xylosian ice. Silence descended, broken only by the settling groans of the canyon and their ragged breaths. They wasted no time. The trio reached the Iridian shuttle, a sleek, bio-organic vessel that still radiated cold. Its systems were unresponsive, locked in a cryo-sleep even deeper than the storm. Jake's fingers, stiff with cold, flew over the access panels. He bypassed critical biocircuitry with salvaged human components, a jury-rigged heating system cobbled from his station's spare parts, and a repurposed power conduit from a defunct comm unit. The cockpit slowly warmed, a faint organic hum starting beneath their feet. A few essential flight functions stuttered to life, glowing green on the console. The damaged Iridian shuttle, running on minimal power, shuddered as Jake brought it off the ice. It lifted with a groan of straining biomatter and human-engineered patches. Climbing on a desperate trajectory toward a known Alliance deep space patrol lane, broadcasting an emergency distress beacon. Days later, a vast Alliance long-range cruiser, a silver Leviathan against the velvet black, detected their unique distress signature. It intercepted the struggling Iridian shuttle, bringing Jake, Estelle, Lyra, and the carefully preserved seed pods safely aboard. Alliance xenobotanists, a flurry of hurried motion and hushed exclamations, initiated immediate analysis of the Iridian seeds. Their initial scans confirmed the seed's unique resilience to the gray blight, and then a breathless discovery, the presence of powerful neutralizing enzymes within the Iridian pollens. Jake watched, a knot of dread and hope tightening in his gut as the data scrolled across the screens. During the Alliance's frantic genetic sequencing, a residual biosignature flared into focus, stark and undeniable. It was a ghost from his past, a mutated form of his own failed terraforming nanite project, improperly disposed of by the Alliance decades prior. The gray blight, his failure. A scientist, her face alight with a mixture of horror and elation, turned to Jake. These enzymes, they're not just resistant, they aggressively neutralize the blight. It's the only known cure, and it's already spreading to human colonies on the outer rim. Jake stood, the weight of his past failure pressing down on him, then lifting impossibly with the dawning realization of what he had truly saved. He received an official commendation from the Alliance, a stiff, formal ceremony he barely registered. His mind was already moving forward. A galactic initiative was swiftly launched, a monumental effort to cultivate the Iridian flora as the universal cure for the gray blight, a verdant shield against an insidious plague. Estelle, her hands now able to gesture with fluid grace, met his gaze. Their burgeoning common language, a blend of Iridian inflections and human words, was rich with new meaning. You saved not just Iridia, you saved us. Her eyes, deep and luminous, held a profound gratitude, acknowledging his compassion, his impossible choice, and in doing so, offering a quiet, unspoken redemption to all of humanity for a past mistake. Jake, Stell, and Lyra, no longer survivors clinging to life, were established as a new, unconventional family. They became integral members of the Interspecies Research and Ecological Restoration Initiative, their shared purpose to heal Iridia and now the galaxy. Years later, Jake stood on the bridge of a verdant Iridian bioship, a living vessel humming with the pulse of burgeoning life. Outside the viewport, a nebula bloomed in colors no human artist could replicate, a cosmic garden. Lyra, no longer a frightened child, but a vibrant young seed-bearer, tended a row of glowing Iridian flora, her laughter a soft chime in the humid air. Estelle stood beside Jake, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, human and alien, a silent testament to a future forged through connection and compassion. The seeds of a dying world had brought them together, and in their hands they nurtured a universe reborn,